Hi, I'm Ethan Allen, your host for Likeable Science. Thanks for joining us today. We're broadcasting here from the Think Tech Studios in Pioneer Plaza. And Likeable Science is all about making science accessible, fun, and helping everyone realize that science is a vital and interesting part of your life, not something to be afraid of, not something to be isolated away, but something to be used and enjoyed. To help me explore that today, I have a very special guest. Dr. Judy Lemus is with me. Welcome, Judy.
Thank you, Ethan. It's great to be here.
Judy works in an area sort of near and dear to my heart, that nexus of science research and what she calls outreach education, though I confess I'm very unfond of the term outreach, but it's that helping people understand science and what it means, why it's important, what goes on in it. And Judy has her own scientific credentials and background in studying symbiosis of marine organisms and how different organisms get together, stay together, hang out together, adapt to each other, adapt to changing environments, but has worked a lot in this area of that interface between education and research, so she has helped form the COSI Island Earth. She is I should have said at the start, she's the Associate Director of the Hawaii Institute for Marine Biology and a faculty member there. She's also a co-author on the Ocean Literacy Essential Principles, and which are a really great document to talk about what everyone really needs to know about our oceans that surround us here. And she's developed a number of different products, some high-tech products, iPhone app, Lokoia, which is for the Hay fish pond here.
Right. Yeah.
Can guide visitors through it and show them data from it and all kinds of good stuff.
Yeah.
It's great. And so she's done a whole bunch of stuff like this, and it's a pleasure to have you here. We're going to talk today about a voyage. Judy just got back from a month-long voyage on a ship down in the Tasman Sea, studying underwater currents, underwater waves, as it were, something like this.
That's right, yeah.
And so give us the big picture, because it's sort of an odd concept to think about that.
It is, and it's a concept I was not familiar with before I went on this cruise, and I should mention that I am not a seagoing person, generally. The biology that I usually study is fairly coastal, and so I have never been on a cruise for this long. So it was a really interesting experience for me, both just in terms of lifestyle of being on a ship, as well as the science, because this is a physical oceanography, and so it was all new to me. And the concept of internal waves and internal tides was not something that I was familiar with before I went on this cruise.
Right, and I suspect that's probably fairly foreign to our viewers here, so let's start with some basic definitions.
Right, okay, so, well, the 3,000-foot view, as you put it, is essentially the ocean undergoes mixing all the time. There are processes that mix the ocean, and those are generally either waves, surface waves, or they are tides. And tides are things that we can observe by the moon causes our tides, and everyone will be familiar with tide coming in, tide going out. Some places on Earth have higher tide ranges than others. But those tides actually also create internal waves within the water column of the ocean. And what happens is essentially that as the tide is moving across the ocean floor, or actually in any depth, if it encounters anything that obstructs its movement, like topography on the seafloor, that causes a ripple in the current. So the water is moving, and say something like a promontory or a seamount comes in its way, then it essentially creates a wave that then passes over that. That wave becomes an internal wave in the ocean because of the different densities between water layers. And these internal waves usually occur where there is a sharp difference between densities in ocean layers. And actually not just ocean layers, as I'll show you later on, even atmospheric layers, that it can happen.
Okay. And those can be caused by saline, temperature, different things like that can cause different densities.
That's right, different densities can be caused by. In the ocean, it's usually temperature. That's the main driver, although it can be salinity as well. And the other things that can kind of drive this also are the oxygen layers can sometimes cause different water masses to move differently. But yeah, temperature is usually the biggest one.
So I think we had a photo to start us off with that you had sent me at the last minute.
I did send you one at the
And
last minute, so
I think we
thanks
can
for...
pull that up. And
Yeah.
so
This is essentially an image created by the chief scientist of the cruise that I was on, Amy Waterhouse, and it shows the whole study site. So there on the bottom right, or kind of in the middle of the right, you'll see the end of New Zealand, the southern island of New Zealand. And off that southern island, there is a very large ridge of ocean mountains. And so what happens is as the tides move across that, it creates this wave that goes across the Tasman Sea. And the Tasman Sea is that area between New Zealand and Tasmania that you see there on the left. So that little heart-shaped island over on the left side of the image is Tasmania. And this project is part of sort of 3 different studies that are happening at the same time. T-tide, which is studying the tides as they come across the continental shelf of Tasmania. T-beam, which is the cruise that I was on, and that is actually studying the actual wave as it moves across the Tasman Sea. And then T-shelf is once it's actually breaking on the Tasman slope, the continental slope, and on the shelf, how the energy is changed by that. And so that image essentially showed all of the different areas that they were looking at within the Tasman Sea.
excellent, excellent.
Yeah.
Wow. So, and then with these 3 different projects, somehow they jointly organized a whole set of cruises, you're saying, several different journeys, and you just went on one of these.
That's right. Yeah,
Okay.
It was a huge collaborative effort.
Okay.
And so the folks at the Scripps Institution of Oceanography were really the leaders, Amy Waterhouse and the group that she works with. But it also involved scientists at the University of Tasmania, the University of Washington Applied Physics Lab, and University of Minnesota and Duluth were main scientists from those institutions, and and University of Alaska at Fairbanks.
Oh.
And so what they did was they proposed several research projects with the National Science Foundation and with different ships that would actually take them on these research cruises. One of them was the RV Falkor, which is operated by the Schmidt Ocean Institute.
Okay. I think we have a photo of that.
You do, yeah.
All right.
And that's the ship that I was on. So that's the Falkor. It's a wonderful ship. It's very comfortable, and it's a great ship to actually be on for a long period of time because it is fairly comfortable. But the other ship that was involved in these research cruises is the RV Revell, which is out of Scripps. And so there was this continual kind of organizational logistics that had to happen for all of these pieces to come together. And in fact, the Revell was also out in the Tasman Sea at the same time that the Falkor was. So we actually had an opportunity to do some very collaborative work with both ships in the same place at the same time, which almost never happens in oceanography.
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, good. Must have been exciting.
Yeah, it was.
Excellent. So you've got a sort of a simulation here, I think, about these waves.
Yeah. The simulation, this is really cool. This was created by Harper Simmons at University of Alaska Fairbanks. And you're seeing in the purple is all of the internal waves that happen once those tides are generated around the ocean. And so if you look at the very bottom there's an arrow, a red arrow. That's the Tasman Sea internal tide. And it's going, you can see it's a direct tide right across the bottom there. And the reason that it's called a beam is because it is so directed. It's pretty much the most prominent type of internal tide that happens in the ocean. But as you could see, internal tides happen everywhere on the planet. There's some places they're more prominent than others, but yeah, they're everywhere.
Excellent,
Yeah.
excellent. We're going to follow this up in just a moment. But right now, we're going to take a little bit of a break here. I'm Ethan Allen, your host on Likeable Science. Dr. Judy Lemus is here with me from the Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology, and we're talking about ocean currents. We'll be right back.
Hi, my name is Andrew Howard. I'm an astronomer at the Institute for Astronomy at the University of Hawaii up in Manoa. I'd like to tell you about the annual open house that we're having. This year, it is on April 6th 11 to 4 p.m. It's an all ages event, kids, grown-ups, even people in between, everyone is welcome. We have a lot of really fun activities. You get to meet astronomers, look at yourself in an infrared camera, play with Legos, make robots, look at videos. You can even make some of the kids like to make comets out of gravel and snow. Even adults like to do that too. You'll be able to look at the sun with a solar camera safely. It's really a great activity. We do this every year in April, and I hope to see you this year. Thanks.
And you're back here on Likeable Science. I'm your host, Ethan Allen. With me here in the Think Tech studios today is Dr. Judy Lemus of the Hawaii Institute for Marine Biology. We're talking about ocean currents and internal waves, internal tides. Judy was explaining to us about the fact these are a pervasive force on Earth that really exist everywhere. She was recently on a month-long voyage in the Tasman Sea studying a particularly, I guess, a prominent example of this, where it's very strong, very direct, and thus, I guess, fairly easy to measure in some sense. And she was talking about the difference between surface waves and internal waves. And I think we have an image that I guess will help further clarify that, right?
Yeah, so let's see. This is actually just a neat example, and it happened while we were on the cruise. And so this cloud pattern that you're looking at here is actually the result of an internal wave in the atmosphere. So internal waves are things that happen within a given medium, and they're caused by differences in densities in that medium. And that happens in the atmosphere as well as in the ocean. So that cloud pattern was an internal wave going through the atmosphere, and you can kind of see where the wave would have done this and created those long streams of clouds.
Right, so similar to what you'll see off a coast, these lines of breakers, we saw those lines of clouds. It was more or less, you're saying, the same kind of phenomenon.
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
Similar to that. And surface waves are different because they're actually happening between two different media. They're happening between the ocean, the water medium, and the atmosphere, the air. But the physics are fairly similar.
Right.
And the wave patterns propagate in a very similar way. It's really still the difference between two densities that this wave is moving through.
Excellent, excellent. So what do these internal waves, internal currents really do in terms of the ocean? What impact do they have on the ocean?
Well, the scientists that are studying them believe that they're very important for mixing. So as we mentioned earlier, oceans are mixed in two different ways, either by waves or by tides. And the tides that we're familiar with are the ones that we can see on the surface, but what we don't see is what those tides are doing in the very deep levels of the ocean. And those internal tides, it looks like, are really important for ocean mixing because they actually create quite a lot of turbulence. And turbulence means that layers get mixed, and if they hit continental slopes, then that energy gets dissipated. And if you can imagine temperatures being, sort of transported from one area to another, you actually then get a lot of dissipation of heat around the globe due to these tidal fluxes and internal tides.
Okay. And the patterns though, from that one diagram are quite different from what we think of as the major ocean currents, that is like the Gulf Stream, and those are only really very shallow phenomena, right? I mean, those are run at just really the surface layers, and most of the ocean, of course, is quite deep, much deeper than people appreciate.
That's right. The ones that we're familiar with are fairly shallow because those are the ones that have been observed in shipping and things that affect our movement around the planet. But in fact, there actually are deep ocean currents as well, and those are caused, again, by differences in density, where you get very cold water in different areas of the Earth, like towards the poles. Water cools down, you get sinking of that water because it gets cold and it's denser, so it sinks, and then that actually creates deep ocean currents, which are also different than tides. Okay. So you have all of these things actually interacting together, so you might have deep ocean currents along with internal tides and
creating internal waves.
It can be very complex, but the whole picture is that there's a lot happening underneath the ocean. And if you recall from that simulation that I just showed, a lot of the internal tides that are created kind of can go in any direction. So they might hit something, and similar to dropping a pebble in a pond, the ripples go outward in all directions equally. That can happen also in the ocean. But in the Tasman Sea, you have a very strong tide coming across this particular group of underwater mountains, and the internal tide essentially just goes in one direction. And that's what makes it really easy to study, is because it's simplified. It's almost like this very natural laboratory to study the movement of that tide.
So it's somewhat maybe parallel to the Bay of Fundy, where you get this rather extreme, rapid, very clear tide that really ebbs and flows very cleanly, very evidently.
Right.
That anyone can watch and sort of see, oh, this is what's happening here.
Yeah, if you want to know, how much of an impact it might make, that's a good place to study it. Yeah.
Okay, great. That's super. So let's talk a little bit about sort of how you do this work. You know, what's involved? What kind of stuff do you need to? I mean, this obviously is taking place deep down in the oceans. You're not going to go down there after it, really, I assume.
Right.
So how?
Oh, you might at one point, yeah.
So how do you sort of what are you measuring, and how do you measure it? You know, how do you observe it?
Yeah. So if we can, I'd like to start with one image that is satellite altimetry data. That is yes. This is it. This is the image.
Okay.
This is great. So the first thing that physical oceanographers do when they're studying these tides is they look at satellite altimetry data. So we have satellites that are orbiting the Earth, and they are measuring sea surface height. And what's interesting about these satellites is that even though they're many hundreds of miles above the seafloor, above the Earth's surface, they actually can detect very small changes in the sea surface. And what you see here is an energy flux map that was created again by Harper Simmons based on changing height of the sea surface.
Wow.
And that sea surface height might only be a few inches, but over time, the satellite altimetry data essentially gives you a very robust picture of what's happening. The internal tide can be hundreds of meters tall. So you might have a 100-meter wave going across the bottom of the ocean at about 4,500 meters deep, really deep, so 4,000 meters deep, but a really huge wave. And that will push water up and down above it. And that will continue to be pushed up all the way to the surface, but by then it's sort of lessened, right?
Spread out and dissipated.
Yeah, and
right.
so you might only get a difference of just a few inches, but the satellites can pick that up. And so this was the first indication that internal tides were happening, because they saw these patterns going across different parts of the ocean. And so that's the first thing that happened, was that scientists were pretty sure that the internal tides were happening in certain areas because of this satellite data. And the whole purpose of the cruise was to go and actually ground truth that and find exactly where that tide is the model, because this is essentially a model. It's a visual image of what they think is happening. But does it actually happen that way? And how fast is it? And how strong is it? And where is it actually occurring? So we first start with satellite data, and then we start with a really large ship that has a lot of oceanographic equipment on it.
Okay. And we've got I think a photo of the control room of that.
Yes, that's right.
That'll give you maybe some sense about that.
Yeah.
Oops.
That's a data slide that we
Okay.
can come back to in a little bit.
Okay.
But the ship does have this really fantastic control room, and the Falkor in particular is very well set up for a lot of this kind of work.
Okay.
But
then maybe we should just jump to this. We have a brief video that sort of shows you working with some of this stuff, and maybe you can describe as that plays how sort of what you're doing with, because I was watching this and see you manipulating gigantic pieces of very complex looking equipment around.
yes.
But it's not always clear from that, what is this thing doing?
Yes,
And-
exactly. What is that? And I will just, I'll start by saying it's not me manipulating it, because I'm taking the photos, but the scientists are doing this. So there's a Falkor again. And so what they're doing here is, this is what's called a CTD rosette. And on that CTD, there are instruments that are measuring currents and measuring temperature, and they have to calibrate those first. So the first series of images they're calibrating them, and if there's any way to pause the video, I can kind of point out a couple things on that. That's fantastic.
Excellent.
So on that rosette, so on that circular cage, essentially, what you're seeing is there are two yellow instruments. One's pointing down and one's pointing up. Those are what measure the current speed. Those are called ADCPs, or acoustic Doppler current profilers, and they work essentially the way that what they do is they take advantage of this effect, the Doppler effect, in which things coming at you making a sound have a different frequency than moving away from you. And so they will send out these pings of sound, and they'll measure particles in the water moving across, and the pings that come back to the instrument, they can tell whether the water's moving toward them or away from them and how fast. So that's essentially what they're doing, and they're looking for that wave coming across the ocean. Okay. And then the other thing that's in this cage are these very, very large gray bottles. They look like tubes there, and they have open ends on either end. And what those are called Niskin bottles, and those go down with the CTD, and I'll explain what a CTD is in just a second. But they can sample water at any particular depth. So they're open, and then they have these trigger mechanisms that they can close both of those ends, and they grab a sample of water at that depth. So you know that the water has come from that depth. And that's important because then you can study things like nutrients and oxygen and carbon
depths,
from known depths. Right. And so what they're doing here is that these two scientists are deploying that CTD, and CTD stands for conductivity, temperature, and depth. And that is what tells us what the salinity and the temperature of the water is at very different depths as it moves down.
So we can probably move.
So we're launching that, and then
so
we can move.
We can move the video along here.
Yeah. And it's a really big process on this ship because it has to go on the back of this A-frame that goes right off the back of a ship, and it's heavy. So you have these taglines that people
The ship is moving and swaying.
Yes, we're trying to stay stationary, but it's especially in the Tasman Sea, we've got a lot of big waves and big swells, and so we're just trying to make sure that that cage doesn't bang up against the ship, and the wires don't get kinked or anything like that. So there's a small picture of what part of the control room looks like, where the data come in, and these are the profiles that you might get on those. And so this is now actually from a GoPro camera that someone is wearing on their helmet, and this is how you recover it. So those lines that you saw them deploying with, they have to be put back on, and they do that with these big poles. So they have to catch the cage, and then they're able to essentially tie it off again. And,
so it doesn't swing
exactly,
too wildly.
so it doesn't swing. These are some of the seas that we experienced in the Tasman Sea, some of the swells. So you'll see these two young graduate students here.
Getting quite wet.
Getting quite wet. But if you notice, they didn't flinch at all. It was amazing. They were just pros. This is a high five after a particularly difficult recovery. And that what these graduate students are doing, along with Pete Sutton there in the back, he's from University of Tasmania, they're collecting the water samples from those Niskin bottles. And he was trying to understand what the impact of this wave moving across might be on phytoplankton in the water. And so the wave might actually be bringing different nutrients up. So these are just some images of clamping down the CTD rosette, and after each one we have to recalibrate. This is something called an XBT, which stands for expendable bathythermograph, and I can explain that in just a second. And here's another CTD going down, same kind of thing, but this one is smaller and actually only sampling at the upper layers, so maybe the first 200 meters of the water, because the CTD cage that we had was so heavy, it really needed to stay below a certain level, otherwise it bounced around too much. So that was a smaller one. And there was a lot of reeling of line on the ship. You seem to be, you're either paying out line or bringing it back in, right. And it takes a long time to do each one. So this was something that we all had to turn on. That's the chief scientist. That's Amy Waterhouse at Scripps. And then here's some of the sampling of those water samples. They're being filtered. And right here, this graduate student is measuring chlorophyll in the water, in that fluorometer. So chlorophyll fluoresces, and you can measure that.
Sure.
And another thing that was being studied on the ship was the prevalence of microplastics in the water. So we're just constantly kind of pulling water in and seeing how many microplastics were in it.
Sure.
The last image that you saw before this is our last day of our cruise, so everyone was celebrating, but we did some connections with classrooms, and so that was really fun too, live Skype connections.
Excellent, excellent. So lovely video here.
Yeah.
That's great to see. It gives a real nice sense about the breadth of activities. It sounds like you were very busy.
Yes, everyone was very busy, except when we had weather days, and then we had nothing to do, and so we watched movies a lot on the ship.
If it was too rocky, you
right,
couldn't...
it was too rough. You can't deploy equipment.
Right.
There were a lot of times when we were actually running from weather, so we had a lot of storms come through, and so we couldn't stay in the spot that we wanted to be in, so we had to move, and when you're moving, you can't deploy equipment either, so yeah, we had, I would say, a fair amount of weather days in which we weren't really that productive for science, but we were trying to do other things. Yeah.
Okay. Well, it looks like a fascinating sort of set of work there. And
yeah, it was a real learning experience for me.
Yeah, I'm sure if you'd not been on one of these cruises before, to go out for a month on your first one was...
Yeah, just go all the way, right? Just dive right in.
Yeah, so we're excellent.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you what, I think we're going to go to another break at this point, but we're going to come back and talk some more about this fascinating voyage and what you found out from it. So you're joining us here on Likeable Science. I'm your host, Ethan Allen. With me today in Think Tech Studios is Dr. Judy Lemus. We're talking about ocean currents and her recent voyage studying ocean currents and all the different ways, means, and variables within those. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Jay Fidel. That's Ted Ralston. You know, Ted is the host of Where the Road Leads. It shows every Friday from 4 to 5 p.m. It's about technology. It's about how people collaborating and solve problems with modern technology. It's where the road leads. We all know that. We should all be listening. Join us there, 4 to 5 p.m. every Friday. Now, what about that do you agree with?
All of it.
I knew he'd say that. Aloha. Say aloha.
Aloha.
Good.
Hi, I'm your host on Think Tech Asia, Bill Sharp. I look forward to you joining us each Monday between 4 and 5 o'clock when we film right here in our studio in downtown Honolulu. The show, Think Tech Asia, focuses on contemporary events in Asia. And by Asia, we mean anything from Hawaii, south to Australia and New Zealand, west to Pakistan, and as far north as the Russian Far East. Clearly, this is one of the most economically dynamic centers of the world, and we bring you up to date on what's going on in a whole host of countries in this very vital region. We look forward to seeing you. Aloha.
Aloha, I'm Kili'i Akina, president of the Grassroot Institute and host on Ehana Kako, a weekly program on the Think Tech Hawaii broadcast network. Ehana Kako means let's work together. Think of the sad alternative, let's not work together. Here in Hawaii, with all of our diversity and the richness of the people, it's important for us to come together around issues on the basis of what's right and what's good and what's going to serve the common good. And that's what we try to do at Ehana Kako. Every week, we interview movers and shakers, people in government, business, and other sectors of society to talk about how to create together a better government, economy, a better world here in Hawaii that can bless the rest of the world. I thank you for your attention to Think Tech Hawaii, and we look forward to seeing you every Monday, 2 to 3 p.m. on the Think Tech Hawaii Broadcast Network. We're Ehana Kako, and we wish you well. Aloha.
The Applied Physics Lab at UW.
Yeah.
I'd known a few of them. Oh, we're back. And here on Likeable Science, I'm your host, Ethan Allen. With me today in the Think Tech Studios is Dr. Judy Lemus from Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology. We've been talking about ocean currents, deep or internal waves, internal currents, I guess you call them. These are subsurface currents running at considerable depth that are driven by tides, basically running into obstructions and topographic features on the ocean floor, causing eddies and turbulence, and very important to mix the ocean. And Judy was just on a month-long voyage in the Tasman Sea, trying to get more, dig down and find out more specifically what those waves were doing, because in the Tasman Sea, it's a very reliable set of those waves that they're focused, they're funneled, they're coming right along in apparently a clean and predictable fashion. And so, so tell us, what did you find?
Well, and again, I won't take credit for what we found. I was along for the ride and documenting, but the scientists that were studying this essentially were able to validate the satellite models and say, yes, in fact, this is where that internal tide beam happens, and that it happens at the predictable time frame. So on the semi-diurnal tidal cycle, which is about every 12 and a half hours. So every 12 and a half hours, this tide comes through, and they were able to capture that actually in with their temperature measurements and densities. And then the other, so I think we might have an image that we can show for that particular, yeah, there's a good one. So this was created by Luke Rainville at University of Washington. And this shows, it's a color image, so it's velocity depicted as color and also with direction, because what you have is red going in one direction and blue going in a different direction. And if you may recall from high school when you learned about waves and tides, they tend to happen in kind of these circular elliptical patterns, and so that's what you're seeing is a push forward of water and then a slight retraction back of water and a push forward, and that happens actually on this semi-diurnal 12-hour cycle.
Oh, okay.
So that was validated, so that was pretty neat. And what's really pretty cool nowadays is that they can take these data fairly quickly and create these really wonderful images with all of the computer programs that they have at their fingertips nowadays.
Excellent.
And then the other thing that we found was there's another image here, and this was done by a graduate student actually at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. This is Dmitry Razhnikov's work, and he models waves and tides. And so what you're seeing here, if you recall the image that we looked at earlier of that energy beam going across, this beam is showing that it's going to hit the Tasman shelf, which is off to the left, and it's not, the image is a little bit compressed, but those lines off to the left are the Tasman shelf, and it's going to hit it north of where the original estimation was. And that actually turns out to be somewhat important in terms of what it might do once it actually gets to the slope of the Tasmanian continental shelf there, because it's different in different places. Sure. And so you can see that internal tide kind of bending to the north. And Dmitry thinks that that's due somewhat to the topography of the mountain ranges on the bottom of the ocean that are causing the wave, and then probably somewhat that having to do with other physical oceanographic processes within the Tasman Sea, like it interacting with other eddies and currents and things that might direct it in different places.
As you said, there are these big perennial deep currents that can be, you're getting your tidal surge across a deep current, and therefore it's dragging the whole thing.
And they happen at so many different time scales as well. You have those deep ocean currents that happen on decades time scales, and then you have this tidal time scale, and then you have eddies, which might happen for a few weeks, and those also have an interaction with the internal tide because they're very big water masses that are circulating, and so it might change the direction or at least the energy of the beam a little bit.
So you had mentioned one of the things you were looking at microplastics, and you found some, I assume, because I gather microplastics are pretty pervasive now throughout the whole ocean.
They are pervasive, and I should have actually brought an image of something that one of the researchers, Randall Lee, was looking at, and it's essentially a map of where plastics might go if they're released in different areas. But what's interesting about this cruise is that in the Tasman Sea, when we were way offshore, we didn't really find many microplastics at all. So it seems to be fairly clean, at least where we happen to be. But the closer we got to shore, the more microplastics we found, which is not surprising.
Right.
And there's a group of people in Victoria studying what's really interesting to me about this project is that they're studying not just the microplastics themselves, but what might be growing on those microplastics. What are the bacterial communities that might be on that, and how are they absorbing and adsorbing metals and other toxins that might be on it? So those metals and toxins also might be able to tell you something about their origin, because they would have picked these things up along their journey, depending on how long they're in the water.
Mm-hmm.
So that data is still kind of being processed, and it was an ancillary part of this project, but actually really a cool thing to be looking at. Pretty much any time, I think, you're out on a ship now, one of the things that would be really easy to do is to start sampling for microplastics.
Right, and I gather actually from some material that I was reading that they have started finding too that a good amount of this stuff actually settles out now and settles on the ocean floor. It's pretty broadly distributed around the world now, and is really getting to be in quite high concentration on the ocean floor. Little polyester fibers and microspheres of various sorts and types and varieties, and is gets actually concentrated there on the floor of the ocean.
That's very likely, actually. I haven't read that, but it seems very plausible because, as I said, if it's picking up metals along the way, obviously that's going to change its buoyancy. It might be sinking out. You might have other things that are attaching to it or even growing on them. And yeah, anytime you have a surface somewhere, there's an opportunity for concentration of something. The other thing that happens with the microplastics is that most people thought that they were always just going to float on the surface, and they don't. Actually, they're often very neutrally buoyant in different depths of the water column. So you can sample at 100 meters and still might get microplastics in the water, which means that fish and other things that are feeding down at those depths are also encountering those microplastics.
Yeah, well, a little disturbing.
Yes.
A little disturbing.
Yeah.
So let me step back for a moment now. We hear a lot these days about that the ocean is actually warming up along with the rest of our global climate. So does that play into this work, or does this work, does what you're studying impact that in the sense of the mixing?
It does, yes. So we know that the ocean is warming. Data definitively tell us that it's warming. It's not warming as fast as the atmosphere, and it's not warming continually or the same in all areas of the ocean. But what's really important for climate models to tell us about how the Earth will respond to climate change and global warming is what does the ocean do? Because right now it looks like the ocean absorbs about 90% of the extra heat that is actually created due to global warming. And how the ocean distributes that heat will affect how different regions of the Earth and how the Earth as a whole responds to climate change.
Right, what we experience actually
exactly.
on land.
What we experience on land, what people in different regions will experience, and a big piece of climate models right now that's not very well understood is the mixing part. So climate modelers would really like much better understanding of how the ocean mixes. And so internal tides are a very big piece, big key of that.
Because this is the way some of the heat on the surface gets to depths and then can be moved all around the globe and released at some far distant place, basically.
Exactly, and how energy is just moved in different to different places in the ocean.
Which is what the water is so good at, because of its massive thermal capacity, basically.
Exactly, and so if you can understand how that is going to be mixed, then their climate models can be that much more accurate.
Right.
And so that's kind of the next piece here. So this work, the ultimate goal is to be able to feed into those climate models and get better pictures.
Yeah, and I guess you could see how complex that must be by thinking about a very simple analogy. If you take a cup of black coffee and pour a little bit of cold cream into it, right? You see it sink first, then it comes back up in little waves and makes all kinds of complex patterns just within a simple, smooth cup of coffee, right?
Yeah, and that's not even swirling the coffee or anything.
Exactly. Yes. Now, on a global scale, much larger volume with many features, topographic features there. So yes, this whole thing, then the cool versus hot becomes a really very complex thing to figure out. But as you say, because of the ocean's role in distributing heat around the ocean, around the globe, it's absolutely critical to understand it, to realize what the role will look like in a few years.
Yes.
Whether you'll have more rain, less rain, hotter winters, cooler summers, whatever.
Yes, where will the warm water concentrate? Does
Right.
it stay in the same region, or does it actually get distributed? Those are really important things, because if it does stay within certain regions, then the thermal expansion of water, so as water warms, it expands slightly,
Right.
and then it becomes less dense, and it actually can contribute to sea level rise because you have a larger
Right.
volume of water. That actually can be regional also. You might not get sea level rise the same all over the
Right.
Earth. And so if that water is regionally warmed and it doesn't get distributed, then places where it is regionally warmed, such as Pacific Islands and islands along the equator, those communities are actually going to be more affected than we either previously thought, and definitely more than other places around the world.
Absolutely, and plus the warming, if that warmth stays locally, that changes your local probability of tropical storms. For instance, I hear that if the ocean around Hawaii warms by simply 0.5 degrees, it will really likely move us into a hurricane band, which we've really not been in. We are very fortunate. Hurricanes tend to swing by and miss us.
Right,
And-
yes, they tend to spin off, and
Right.
yeah, we're
And
very
if
lucky.
we're half a degree warmer, we're likely then to catch the brunt of a whole lot more hurricanes. And with so much of Hawaii's infrastructure lying basically at sea level, that could be a very non-trivial issue for our sustainability.
Absolutely, and the other thing that might happen is that we actually have less rain regularly because our cloud layer might actually be pushed up, and so our mountains don't catch the clouds, and so we don't get normal, regular rain, but we're going to get this really strong episodic rains from hurricanes and storms, which is not as helpful as regular rain. It will completely change
Right.
our weather patterns.
And just as these problems may be bad for us here, they're likely to be worse on the smaller, lower Pacific islands. The Marshall Islands I always think of as a classic example, that they cannot afford any significant sea level rise.
Yes, there's nowhere to go.
Right. Storms are bad enough already in terms of having complete washovers, and a large hurricane could make those far worse, and their climate is already much more variable than it used to be. They cannot rely on the rainfall patterns they've traditionally relied on for the past thousands of years.
Yes.
And so yeah, they may be in even worse shape in a lot of sense.
Yeah. So there are actually quite important complications and implications for this work,
Right.
and so I think that, and I should mention actually, since we're talking about Hawaiian Islands and Pacific Islands, that a lot of the physics for internal waves and tides was worked out here in Hawaii, I'm told, because there are several places around the globe that have very prominent internal tides. Tasmania is one, but actually Hawaii is one also, and off of South Africa. So Hawaii is one of the first places that they actually started to understand the physics of internal waves created. And so a lot of the work was actually done here, and we do have researchers here in Hawaii, at the University of Hawaii, studying those internal waves.
So this then probably actually gets towards a question that's been niggling in my mind ever since I moved here. When I see how different the times for high tides are just around Oahu, which being a small island, you would sort of think, if simplistically the tides have to do with the Earth's position relative to the moon, that your high tide times, for instance, should vary only a few moments across the island, but they don't. They vary actually by quite a significant amount because of the same kinds of eddies and turbulent currents and this kind of stuff basically happening on the slopes of the undersea mountain that we live on.
Right, I think so, and all of the topography essentially
Right.
that happens, and we do have really complex currents that do happen, and we have quite rough seas at times because of that, not only the weather patterns, but because of our topography, and
Wow.
it's quite interesting.
Well, excellent. Very neat to see. This has been a fascinating conversation. I've learned a ton, and I hope our viewers have too. You've been with us on Likeable Science here. I've had with me today in the studio Dr. Judy Lemus from Hawaii Institute of Marine Biology, telling us all about her month-long voyage in the Tasman Sea, studying physical oceanography of undersea internal waves and currents. And this has been a very enlightening talk, very enjoyable. Thank you so much for being here, Judy.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed it.
Okay. Aloha.
Aloha.